and welcome to Sussex Street Christian Centre's reflection series on the Gospel of Mark. We hope and pray that you are blessed by them and through them as they aid to your spiritual growth and relationship to God, as well as inspire you to action in your service of God and the kingdom he is wanting to establish. So in today's reflection we'll be focusing on Mark chapter 5 verses 21 to 43, and I'll be reading from the N.I.V. When Jesus had again crossed over by boat to the other side of the lake, a large crowd gathered around him while he was by the lake. Then one of the synagogue leaders, named Jairus, came, and when he saw Jesus, he fell at his feet. He pleaded earnestly with him, "My little daughter is dying. Please come and put your hand on her, so that she will be healed and live." So Jesus went with him. A large crowd followed and pressed around him, and a woman was there who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years. She had suffered a great deal under the care of many doctors and had spent all she had, yet instead of getting better, she grew worse. When she heard about Jesus, she came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak, because she thought, "If I just touch his clothes, I will be healed." Immediately her bleeding stopped, and she felt in her body that she was freed from her suffering. At once, Jesus realized that power had gone out of him. He turned around in the crowd and asked, "Who touched my clothes?" "You see the people crowding against you," his disciples answered, "and yet you can ask, 'Who touched me?'" But Jesus kept looking around to see who had done it. Then the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell at his feet and, trembling with fear, told him the whole truth. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering." While Jesus was still speaking, some people came from the house of Jairus and synagogue leader. "Your daughter is dead," they said. "Why bother the teacher anymore?" Overhearing what they said, Jesus told him, "Don't be afraid. Just believe." He did not let anyone follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. When they came to the home of the synagogue leader, Jesus saw a commotion, with people crying and wailing loudly. He went in and said to them, "Why all this commotion and wailing? The child is not dead, but asleep." But they laughed at him. After he put them all out, he took the child's father and mother and the disciples who were with him, and went in where the child was. He took her by the hand and said to her, "Talitha cum," which means, "Little girl, I say to you, get up." Immediately the girl stood up and began to walk around. She was 12 years old. At this, they were completely astonished. He gave strict orders not to let anyone know about this, and told them to give her something to eat. I encourage you from the start to be like a fly on the wall of this story, watching and picturing what is being presented, or even better, picture yourself as one of the crowd or a disciple. Ask yourselves questions like, how would I have responded? How would I have interpreted what was being said and done? Things like, what shocked you? What frustrates you? And what inspires you? We see, again, a large crowd gathers around Jesus, and within that crowd we are told that there is a synagogue leader named Jairus. His daughter is on death's door. He approaches Jesus, falls at Jesus' feet, and pleads with him to put his hand on her and she will live. Now, firstly, isn't the passion of this father commendable? Now, Jesus is obviously moved by Jairus' story and goes with him to his house. Now imagine there's a relief in Jairus, but I'm sure Jairus couldn't get back home quick enough. You can picture him ushering Jesus along, shouting at the crowd, "Get out the way! You're slowing the journey down." However, all the crowd wants is a piece of Jesus, to be blessed, to receive a word and some attention. But in Jairus' mind, he's probably saying, "Come on, hurry up, my daughter, my daughter." And as we read further on, the crowd were almost swamping Jesus. They were pressing up against him, when all of a sudden Jesus stops. And much to Jairus' frustration, I'm sure, he stops, all because someone touched him. But this wasn't just any normal type of touch. Jesus felt that power had been drawn from him. And so he stops, turns around and asks the crowd, "Who touched me?" Now the disciples, in their disbelief, they question Jesus himself. "You're in a crowd. They're all up against you. What do you expect, Jesus?" Have you ever been a place where there's been an awkward silence? I think of a time when being in a classroom and someone does something while the teacher is writing on the whiteboard, and the teacher spins round, not knowing who it was, but asks the question, "Who was it that made that noise?" And then there's an awkward silence in the room and everyone's looking at each other in sort of like, "Ooh." Now he waited until the person came forward. How frustrating is this for Jairus? "Come on, Jesus, shake a leg. My daughter is dying. Come on, let's go." It is here within this atmosphere that we're introduced to the culprit, a woman who had been bleeding for 12 years. Now, from a cultural and religious perspective, a woman couldn't touch a rabbi. Not only that, she was considered ceremonially unclean, and thus socially unclean due to her bleeding. And because of this, she couldn't touch or be touched by anyone, because that would make them unclean. She had exhausted every other option. She had spent every penny she had on doctors, but they only made the situation worse. Because they didn't have the knowledge, the understanding, the tools, or the medication to give her any relief, it left her in an incurable, helpless and hopeless situation. That is until she heard of Jesus, and she said to herself, if I only just touch his clothes, I will be healed. Now this was a desperate last attempt, as she, with great faith and courage, risked everything, essentially her life, by forcing herself through the crowd, touching multiple people as she did, just to touch Jesus' clothes. Imagine for just a moment if it hadn't have worked. But the great thing is that it did. But the crowd didn't know. Perhaps Jesus was using this to illustrate to the crowd something incredibly profound. Now she confesses to the touching. She falls at his feet and tells him the whole truth, her story. He shows compassion, grace and mercy. Now we can see this in an argument or a discussion that Jesus has in Matthew chapter 12 verses 3 to 7 between him and the Pharisees. And he's discussing with them that the needs of God's people are higher, or the priority is higher for God's people than their ceremonial observance. Which is why he doesn't rebuke this woman or make an issue of the woman's technical violation of the law. And notice he blesses her, calling her daughter. Your faith has healed you. Jesus says, go in peace and be freed from your suffering. This peace must have been so sweet for this woman, because Jesus alludes to a peace that she hadn't experienced for 12 years. A peace with her community and the religious institution. It's like Go now, not in fear, not in trembling, not in misery, but in peace, and be healed. Reconciled into community, restored into the religious life of the community, and her God-given identity was restored. However, while Jesus was still blessing this woman, the story takes a sharp decline from elation and celebration to despair for Jairus. And a word comes to him, the worst news that a father could hear, especially while waiting for the remedy to come, and that is that his daughter has died, and there's no point bothering Jesus anymore. Imagine if you're Jairus right now, how would you feel? How would you react? Jesus, overhearing this news, this sad, tragic news, says, don't be afraid. Just believe. Now Jesus, only allowing Peter, James and John, the brother of James, to follow him with Jairus, he was greeted at the house by a commotion of wailing and crying. Now it was a Jewish custom that upon the death of a family member, that family would hire professional mourners to rend their garments, weep and wail to signify the death of a family member to the community. And the group size of these professional mourners was determined by economics. If you were poor, then the minimum is that you were to hire at least 2 flute players and 1 female wailer. But we know that Jairus was a ruler of the synagogue, so his family most likely had a whole procession. Can you imagine the commotion, the noise? And Jesus, seeing this, challenges it and says, why all this commotion and wailing? The child is not dead, but asleep. That blows my mind. And if I'm honest, my gut response would be first to question, but also to laugh as well. Like, are you kidding me? And for these professional mourners who had been around death a lot because it was their job, I'm pretty sure that they were sure that they knew what death looked like, which then would result in a more qualified laughter on their part. So Jesus goes with his selected disciples, with Jairus and the mother, into the bedroom of the little girl, and Jesus takes the little girl's hand. And I find this amazing because this time he goes in knowingly into a room and touches a corpse and knowingly defies himself. But this is only solidifying the notion that Jesus saw that the need of God's people outweighed the ceremonial law. He says to the little girl, Talitha koum, and she rose. Oh, how amazing is the word of God and the power in his words. God brought the whole world into creation by the sound of his voice. Let there be. Much like Lazarus out the tomb, by his oral command, and in the same way, he commands this little girl to rise. His almighty word is effective. Now they were unsurprisingly amazed. But imagine yourself in this situation, and I'm sure you would have wanted to climb out onto the roof and proclaim what had just happened to the whole world, right? However, yet again, Jesus commands them not to tell anyone about this, but simply give their daughter something to eat. Oh, what an amazing story of the power that Jesus has over disease, the power over death, the power over lost causes. All of these converge in the touch of Jesus. This is the Lord in whom we place our trust, for all things, for all time. So what about some applications, which there are many, but taking into account Jairus' experience, how often do we get frustrated at God's timing? If only Jesus would walk a little quicker. If only Jesus would focus on just me for this one time. If only Jesus would work a little sooner. Is God distracted? I don't think so. Throw up your petitions to him. He can hear every single person's prayer and desire and concern and worry. And are there any people that you would consider unclean right now that need a touch from the King?